Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S. has officially withdrawn its last designated combat brigade from Iraq 2 weeks ahead of a deadline for the withdrawal of some 14,000 troops. In a surprise announcement, the Pentagon said its last combat brigade crossed over from Iraq into Kuwait earlier today. Although withdrawal has been hailed as a major milestone and an end to combat operations, most of the remaining 56,000 U.S. troops in Iraq are still trained in combat and will continue to carry out armed attacks. The Obama administration also plans to double its private military force in Iraq to an estimated 7,000 contractors. According to the New York Times, the bulk of the private force will be deployed at 5 compounds across Iraq, performing duties including operating drones, deploying reaction forces, and operating radars to detect militant attacks. In an interview on Democracy Now!, independent journalist Jeremy Scahill said the Obama administration's withdrawal plan amounts to a rebranded occupation.
What is essentially unfolding here is a downsized and rebranded occupation Obama style that is going to necessitate a surge in private forces. The State Department is asking for MRAP vehicles, armored vehicles, for Black Hawk helicopters, and for these paramilitary forces. So yes, you can say that officially combat has ended, but in reality, you're continuing it through the back door by bringing in these paramilitary forces and classifying them as diplomatic security, which was Bush's game from the very beginning.
In Afghanistan, hundreds of people have blocked a main highway outside the city of Jalalabad to protest the killings of 2 Afghan civilians and the arrest of several others in a U.S. raid. A local police commander said the slain victims were a father and his son.
As a result of the operation in the house, 2 people have been martyred, a father and his son, and 3 others have been taken away. Those who have been killed and those who have been taken away are farmers working in the lands.
The Obama administration's warning an Afghan government ban on private military firms could harm U.S. aid and development work in Afghanistan. Afghan President Hamid Karzai issued a decree this week ordering all private firms to disband within 4 months. About 26,000 armed security contractors work with the U.S. government in Afghanistan, including 19,000 with the U.S. military. In a statement, the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan said, quote, "We're concerned that any quick action to remove private security companies may have unintended consequences, including the possible delay of U.S. reconstruction and development assistance efforts." The United Nations General Assembly is holding an emergency session today to raise emergency aid for millions of Pakistanis devastated by massive floods. The UN says vital supplies have reached just 1 million of the 8 million people in urgent need. The number of Pakistanis left permanently homeless by the floods has been doubled to 4 million, with some 20 million displaced overall. The U.S. is expected to announce it's increasing aid to $150 million from the $90 million pledged so far. In Peru, the U.S. activist Lori Berenson has been sent back to prison just 3 months after she was freed on parole. Berenson had served nearly 15 years following her 1996 conviction for collaborating with the rebel group, the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, or MRTA. Her return to jail appears to rest on a narrow technicality concerning the location of her home during her parole. We'll have more on the story after headlines. We'll speak with her mother in Lima. Newly disclosed court records show the U.S. is still holding an emotionally ill Yemeni prisoner at Guantanamo 6 years after he was first cleared for release. The prisoner, Adan Abdul Latif, was granted Pentagon approval to be freed in 2004, but was only placed on a transfer list 3 years later. Latif has remained at Guantanamo since because the U.S. has stalled most transfers of Yemeni prisoners back home. Defense attorneys say he spent long periods in Guantanamo's psychiatric ward following multiple suicide attempts. A federal judge again ordered Latif's release last month, but the Obama administration's refused to comply while it considers an appeal. The American Civil Liberties Union has filed a lawsuit accusing the U.S. government of stonewalling an attempt to unearth details of the alleged torture and imprisonment of a U.S. citizen in the United Arab Emirates 2 years ago. The alleged victim, Naji Hamdan, was held for nearly 3 months without charge and was denied access to a lawyer and contact with his family. Hamdan says he was beaten, kicked in the liver, strapped to an electric chair, and told his wife would be raped in front of him. Hamdan moved to the UAE from the United States in 2006 after being the target of intense FBI scrutiny. He was jailed just weeks after FBI agents questioned him at the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi. The ACLU says the federal government has ignored a 6-month-old Freedom of Information Act request for information about the FBI's long-term surveillance of Hamdan, as well as the role the U.S. played in his imprisonment and torture. Hamdan has claimed an unidentified American took part in his interrogation. The Obama administration is being accused of leveraging millions in development aid to pressure the Indian government for leniency on the company responsible for the 1984 Bhopal industrial gas disaster that left an estimated 15,000 people dead. The company, Union Carbide, is now a subsidiary of Dow Chemical. Dow's faced calls to clean up the contaminated site, increase compensation for victims, and fund studies to assess damages to the environment and public health. India has also demanded the extradition of former Union Carbide CEO Warren Anderson, who fled shortly after his arrest in the disaster's aftermath. In a newly disclosed letter to an Indian government official, White House Deputy National Security Advisor Michael Froman appears to link U.S. support for World Bank loans to India with India's cooperation in easing up on Dow. Froman writes, quote, "We are hearing a lot of noise about the Dow Chemical issue. I trust that you are monitoring it carefully. I am not familiar with all the details, but I think we want to avoid developments which put a chilling effect on our investment relationship." Former Democratic National Committee Chair Howard Dean's become the latest high-profile Democrat to oppose the construction of an Islamic community center blocks from New York's Ground Zero. In a radio interview, Dean said he thinks the plan is, quote, an affront to 9/11 victims. Dean also appeared to erroneously suggest the proposed cultural center would be built at Ground Zero.
We have to understand that it is a real affront to people who lost their lives, including Muslims. That site doesn't belong to any particular religion. It belongs to all Americans and all faiths. So I think a good, reasonable compromise could be worked out. I think it's great to have mosques in American cities. There's a growing number of American Muslims. I think most of those Muslims are moderate. I hope that they'll have an influence on Islam throughout the world, because Islam is really back in the 12th century in some of these countries like Iran and Afghanistan, where they're stoning people to death. And that can be fixed. And the way it's fixed is not by pushing Muslims away. It's by embracing them and have them become just like every other Americans who happen to be Muslims.
Howard Dean is one of the most prominent Democrats to oppose the center since Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid came out against it last week. President Obama has said he supports the right of Muslims to build at the site, but has refused to comment on whether he supports the project itself. Asked about his comments during a visit to Ohio Wednesday, Obama maintained his stance.
Any regrets jumping into the Islamic Center?
The answer is no regrets.
Thank you, sir.
New figures show the U.S. deported over 393,000 foreign nationals in 2009, a record high for the 7th consecutive year. The Department of Homeland Security says just over a quarter of the deportees had been convicted of criminal offenses. 72% of the total number were undocumented immigrants from neighboring Mexico. The Justice Department is threatening to sue Arizona's Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio if he does not cooperate with a civil rights investigation into whether Arpaio discriminates against Hispanics. The probe was launched last year following widespread allegations that Arpaio has overseen a discriminatory enforcement of federal immigration laws. Federal prosecutors say Arpaio's office has refused to hand over documents and turned down requests to meet with investigators. A federal grand jury is holding a separate probe into whether Arpaio has used his position to target political opponents. And the bailed-out auto giant General Motors has taken steps to sell off company shares in a public offering later this year. On Wednesday, GM filed papers with regulators that would allow the U.S. government to unload its majority stake. GM avoided collapse with a taxpayer-funded $50 billion bailout last year, earning it the nickname Government Motors. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy